also known by his initials, Fdr, was born into a wealthy family on January 30th, 1882. The Roosevelt family had been notable for their presence in the United States for several generations. They achieved their wealth through real plantations and trades. Franklin was the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Anna Delena Roosevelt. The family resided at Springwood, their estate in Hudson River in New York State. Growing up, Roosevelt was entitled to pleasure and sense of importance. His education was very much different from a common person, that he later fought for. Roosevelt attended Girton School for Boys, a prestigious prep school in Massachusetts, in 1896. The experience was a challenging one for him. He did not really communicate with other students. Girton men did exceptionally well in athletics, but Roosevelt did not. After he graduated from Girton in the 1900s, Roosevelt entered Harvard University. He focused on making something of himself. Despite only being a C student, he joined the Alpha Delta fraternity and served as an editor at Harvard Crimson newspaper, where he obtained his degree within a 3-year period. Still, he was looked upon as an average student and as an underachiever. During his final year at Harvard, he became engaged to Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin. She was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt. They married on March 17, 1905. Roosevelt went on to study law at Columbia University Law School and passed the bar exam in 1907, but he did not acquire a degree. He practiced corporate law in New York over the next 3 years, living a usual noble life. He had little to no interest in law practice and felt it was unexciting. He decided to set his prospects at a bigger and better accomplishment. In 1910, 28 years old, Roosevelt was invited to run for the New York State Senate. He campaigned hard and won the election with the name recognition and an overwhelming Democratic majority. As state senator, Roosevelt disapproved components of the Democratic political machine in New York. During this time, Roosevelt reestablished an association with Louis Howe, who would play a role in his political career for the next 25 years. Roosevelt won re-election in 1912, serving as chair of the Agriculture Committee. He enacted farm and labor bills and social welfare programs. During the 1912 Democratic National Convention, Roosevelt endorsed presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson. In return, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the same job his hero, Theodore Roosevelt, had used to get to the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt was an enthusiastic and effective administrator. He had an attentive to business operations and worked in the Congress to approve budget and reform systems. Roosevelt decided to run for the U.S. Senate seat for New York in 1914. However, his bid was doomed from the start due to a lack of White House support. President Wilson needed the Democratic political machine to successfully pass his social reforms and guarantee his re-elections. Still, he could not re-endorse Roosevelt, who had too many political enemies amongst New York Democrats. While on vacation at Campola Island in New Brunswick, Canada, he was diagnosed having contracted polio. At first, he refused to accept that he was permanently paralyzed. He tried countless treatments and even bought the Warm Springs Resort in Georgia, seeking a treatment. In spite of his efforts, he recovered the use of his legs. For a while, Roosevelt was submissive to being a victim of polio and feared that his political career was over. But Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, and political confidant Louis Howe inspired him to carry on. Throughout the next several years, Roosevelt worked on recovering his physical and political image. He taught himself to walk short distances in his brace and was cautious about being seen in public in a wheelchair. Moreover, he began to improve his relationship with New York Democrat political machine. Roosevelt appeared at the 1924 and 1928 Democratic National Convention to nominate New York Governor Al Smith for president, which increased his national experience. The 46-year-old Roosevelt was narrowly elected the president, and the victory gave him an assurance that his political star was on the rise. But in 1930, Republicans were being blamed for the Great Depression, and Roosevelt saw this as an opportunity. He began campaigning for the presidency and called for the government involvement in the economy to offer the 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform. When Roosevelt assumed office in March 1933, 13 million Americans were unemployed, while hundreds of banks were closed. Roosevelt was now faced with the greatest disaster in U.S. history since the Civil War. During his first 100 days, President Roosevelt put forward a sweeping economic reform known as the New Deal. He ordered a temporary closing of all banks to end the run on bonds, and other organizations protected bank deposits, regulated the stock markets, sponsored loans, and provided assistance to the unemployed. Early in 1940, Roosevelt had not publicly announced that he would run for an unparalleled third term as president. But in secret, with Germany victories in Europe and Japan's rising domination in Asia, Roosevelt felt that he had an experience and skill to lead America through such sorrow times. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Roosevelt defeated all of his challengers and won the nomination. In November 1940, he won the president election in a landslide, becoming the only president to be elected a third term. Throughout 1941, President Roosevelt pushed to have the United States factories become an arsenal of democracy for the 3 allies, France, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. President Roosevelt took advantage and stood firm against the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Aspirations of keeping the United States out of war ended when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The next day, President Roosevelt declared that it would be a date which we will live in infamy. The pressures of war, however, began to take its toll on President Roosevelt. In March 1944, hospital tests showed that coronary artery disease and congestive heart failure were being upon President Roosevelt. Despite this, and because the country was heavily involved in war, there was no question that Roosevelt would run for another term as president. He selected Senator Harry Truman of Missouri as running mate. Together, they defeated the Republican candidate Thomas E. Dewey, carrying the 36 of the 48 states. In February 1945, President Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Soviet General Secretary Joseph Stalin, and deliberate post-war reorganizations. He then returned to the United States and the reservations of Warm Spring, Georgia. On the afternoon of April 12, 1945, Roosevelt suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. He died that day at 3:35 p.m. He was only 63. President Roosevelt's unexpected death played a huge toll on the American population. It took them out of their roots. Though many saw that he looked shattered in photos and documentaries, no one seemed prepared for his death. Franklin D. Roosevelt led the United States through a financial and the greatest war in human history. A whole generation of America grew up knowing no other president. His social programs during the Great Depression redefined the whole of government and the lives of the American people.